Good morning. Good evening. Good afternoon, and remember, Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, Chapter 24, Section 2. Yesterday, Chapter 24, Section 1. We talked about the longest reigning Queen of England. You can check in that video here to see. She wore black. Why did she wear black? Today, we talk about a century of reform. My name is John Michael. Please like and subscribe. My name is John Michael. Context is Everything Media Network CFO, CEO, and social media marketer. Please follow and subscribe. That's me doing my marketing. Section 2. Chapter 24. Thank you. A century of reform. Setting the scene. Her aristocratic family would have been shocked. Here was Lady Constance Lytton, disguised as a seamstress and lying in a prison hospital. Lytton, Lytton, had been arrested for taking part in a women's suffrage protest. Now, she refused to eat. Her hunger strike, she vowed, would go until the British government granted the vote to women. Lytton later recalled, "I was visited again by the senior medical officer, who asked me how long I had been without food. I said I had eaten a buttered scone and a banana sent by friends to the police station on Friday at midnight. He said, 'Oh then, this is your fourth day. That is too long. I shall feed you. I must feed you at once.'" Constance Lytton in Prisons and Prisoners, her writing. In the end, the doctor, with the help of 5 prison matrons, force-fed Lytton through a tube. Yet the painful ordeal failed to weaken her resolve. "No surrender," she whispered. "No surrender." Lytton's 1910 hunger strike was part of a long struggle for women's suffrage in Britain. Suffragists were not the only people to fight for change. Between 1815 and 1914, Parliament responded to widespread discontent with a series of social and economic reforms. At the same time, the question of British control over Ireland was becoming a dominant and divisive political issue. Social and economic reform. New heading. Social and economic reform. During the early and mid-1800s, Parliament passed a wide variety of important new laws. One of the most controversial measures involved the issue of free trade, or trade between countries without quotas, tariffs, or other restrictions. Free trade and the Corn Laws. In the early 1800s, Britain, like other European nations, taxed foreign imports in order to protect local economies. But supporters of free trade demanded an end to such protective tariffs. Free traders, usually middle-class business leaders, agreed with Adam Smith that policy of laissez-faire would increase prosperity for all. If tariffs were abolished, merchants everywhere would have larger markets in which to sell their goods, and consumers would benefit from open competition. Some British tariffs were replaced in the 1820s. However, fierce debate erupted over the Corn Laws, which imposed high tariffs on important grain. In Britain, corn refers to cereal grains, such as wheat, barley, and oats. Farmers and wealthy landowners supported a corn law because they kept the price of British grain high. Free traders, however, wanted Parliament to repeal or cancel the Corn Laws. They argued that the repeal of these laws would lower the prices of grain and make bread cheaper for city workers and open up trade in general. I think that there's a song that came out of this struggle of the Corn Laws. The old British seafarer would sing, "Mares eat oats and does eat oats and little lambs eat ivy. A kid'll eat ivy too, wouldn't you? Hey, 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 mares eat oats and does eat oats and little lambs eat ivy. A kid'll eat ivy too, wouldn't you? Da, da. And if the words sound queer and funny to your ear, a little bit jumble and jivey, you say mares eat oats and does eat oats and little lambs eat ivy." Parliament finally repealed the Corn Laws in 1846 after widespread crop failures swept many parts of Europe. Liberals hailed the repeal as a victory for free trade and laissez-faire capitalism. However, in the late 1800s, economic hard times led Britain and other European countries to impose protective tariffs on many goods. Campaign against slavery. During the 1700s, Enlightenment thinkers had turned the spotlight on the evils of the slave trade. At the time, British ships were carrying more Africans to the Americas than was any other European country. At the time, British ships were carrying more Africans to the Americas than was any other European country. Under pressure from the middle-class reformers, the campaign against the slave trade and slavery slowly took off. In 1807, Britain became the first leading European power to abolish the slave trade. Banning the slave trade did not end slavery, although Congress of Vienna had condemned slavery. It had taken no action. In Britain, liberals preached the immorality of slavery. Finally, in 1833, Parliament passed a new law banning slavery in all British colonies. Yet, British textile manufacturers still imported cheap cotton produced by enslaved African Americans in the United States, similar to how we get our cell phone batteries and car batteries now for like electric cars from what is in essence slave labor in, I believe, the Congo. So I guess we're not that much better than the British people of 1833. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm entirely open to that possibility. Entirely. Crime and punishment. Punishment and crime. Other reforms were aimed at the criminal justice system. In the early 1800s, more than 200 crimes were punishable by death. Such capital offenses included not only murder, but also shoplifting, sheep stealing, and impersonating an army veteran. In practice, some juries refused to convict criminals because the punishments were so harsh. Executions were public occasions, and hangings of a well-known murderer might attract thousands of curious spectators. Afterward, instead of receiving proper burial, the criminal's body might be given to a medical college for dissection. Victorian reformers began to reduce the number of capital offenses. By 1850, the death penalty was reserved for murder, piracy, treason, and arson. Many petty criminals were instead transported to penal colonies or special settlements for convicts in the new British territories of Australia and New Zealand. In 1868, Parliament ended public hangings. Additional reforms improved prison conditions and outlawed imprisonment for debt. Oh, interesting. So you're telling me it was like 1850 when England started shipping people to Australia? I don't know anything about Australia. Victories for the working class. New heading. 4 ghosts haunt the poor. Old age, accident, sickness, and unemployment, declared Liberal politician David Lloyd George in 1905. We are going to expel them. By the 1900s, Parliament gradually passed a series of reforms designed to help men, women, and children whose labor supported the new industrial society. Working conditions. As you have read, working conditions in the industrial age were grim and often dangerous. Gradually, Parliament passed laws to regulate conditions in factories and mines. In 1842, for example, mine owners were forbidden to employ women and children under the age of 10. In 1847 law limited women and children to a 10-hour day. I guess children over the age of 10. Later in the 1800s, but women or children under the age of 10? 1842. Okay, let me just say this again because this sounds like a blatant contradiction of itself. Sentence to sentence. In 1842, for example, mine owners were forbidden to employ women or children under the age of 10. That's 1842. In 1847, in 1847, 5 years later, in 1847, law limited women and children to a 10-hour day. So I can see that you're saying children over the age of 10, but I thought you just said that you can't employ women. Or are you saying women under the age of 10? What is going on? That is wrong. You're saying something wrong. You have to be textbook. You have to be saying something wrong. That doesn't make any sense. Later in the 1800s, the government regulated many safety conditions in factories and mines and sent inspectors to see that the laws were enforced. Other laws set minimum wages and maximum hours of work. Labor unions. Early in the Industrial Revolution, labor unions were outlawed. Under pressure of government and business leaders, slowly accepted worker organizations. Trade unions were made legal in 1825. At the same time, through strikes, though strikes remained illegal. So unions were legal, strikes were not. Between 1890 and 1914, union membership soared. Besides higher wages and shorter hours for workers, unions pressed for other laws to improve the lives of the working class. Later reforms. During the 1800s and early 1900s, both political parties enacted social reforms to benefit the working class. Disraeli sponsored laws to improve public health and housing for workers in cities, and Gladstone, an Education Act, called for free elementary education for all children. Gladstone also pushed to open up government jobs based on merit rather than birth or wealth. In 1900, socialists and union members backed the formation of new political party, which became known as the Labor Party. The Labor Party would grow in power in membership until the 1920s. It surpassed the Liberal Party as one of Britain's 2 major parties. Interesting. That's more interesting than that. Let's use this here. In the early 1900s, Britain began to pass social welfare laws to protect the well-being of poor and disadvantaged. They protected workers with accident, health, and unemployment insurance, as well as old age pensions. One result of such reforms was that Marxism gained only limited support among the British working class. The middle class hailed reforms as proof that democracy was working, similarly to what the German guy did, Otto von Bismarck, but it didn't work out. That actually led to the growth of socialism in Germany. Votes for women, new heading. Votes for women. In Britain, as elsewhere, women struggled for the right to vote against strong opposition. Just as Parliament had rejected the Chartists' demand for universal male suffrage in 1848, so it resisted the demand for women suffrage movement 50 years later. Women themselves were divided on this issue. Some women opposed suffrage altogether. Queen Victoria, for example, called suffrage struggle, mad, wicked folly. Even women in favor of suffrage disagreed about how to best achieve it. Suffragists revolt. By the early 1900s, Emmeline Pankhurst, a leading suffragist, had become convinced that only aggressive tactics could bring victory. Pankhurst and other radical suffragists interrupted speakers in Parliament shouting, "Votes for women!" until they were carried away. They collected petitions and organized huge public demonstrations. During one suffragist rally in London's Hyde Park, organizers brought demonstrators from all over Britain. An astonished newspaper reporter wrote, "It is probable that so many people have never before stood in one square mass anywhere in England." When mass meetings and other peaceful efforts brought no result, some women turned to violent protest. They smashed windows or even burned buildings. Pankhurst justified these tactics as necessary to achieve victory. "There is something that governments care far more for than human life," she declared, "and that is the security of property, so that there is thorough property that we shall strike the enemy. It is through their property that we will strike the enemy." Pankhurst and other women, included her daughters Christabel and Sylvia, were arrested and jailed. As you have read, some went on hunger strikes, risking their lives to achieve their goals. One radical suffragist died when she threw herself in front of the king's horse. A belated victory. Many middle-class women disapproved of such radical and violent actions, yet they too spoke up in increasing numbers, demanding votes for women and equity under the law. Still, Parliament refused to grant women suffrage. Not until 1918 did Parliament finally grant suffrage to women over the age of 30. Younger women did not win the right to vote until another decade. The Irish question. New heading. And we have probably about 7 minutes left. Thank you for your time. My name is John Michael. Please like and subscribe. Please put this on for your dog while you're away. We all have obligations that take us away from our home. And when you're away, choose the Context is Everything Media Network playlist as your dog's company. The Irish question. Throughout the 1800s, Britain faced ever-present Irish question. The English had begun conquering Ireland in the 1100s, and in the 1600s, the Scottish settlers colonized Ireland, taking possession of much of the best farmland. The Irish never accepted English rule. They bitterly resented settlers, especially absentee landlords, who owned large estates but did not live on them. Many Irish peasants lived in desperate poverty, while paying high rents to landlords living in England. In addition, the Irish, most of whom were Catholic, had to pay tithes to support the Church of England. Under these conditions, resistance and rebellion were common. Irish nationalism. Like the national minorities in the Austrian Empire, the Irish nationalists campaigned vigorously for freedom and justice in the 1800s. Nationalist leader Daniel O'Connell, nicknamed the Liberator, organized the Irish Catholic League and held mass meetings to demonstrate and repeal unfair laws. "My first object," declared O'Connell, "is to get Ireland for the Irish." I need to remember how to do an Irish accent, I forgot. Under pressure from O'Connell, the Irish nationalists, Britain slowly moved to improve conditions in Ireland. In 1829, Parliament passed the Catholic Emancipation Act, which allowed Irish Catholics to vote and hold political office. Yet many injustices remained. Absentee landlords could evict tenants almost at will. Other British laws forbade teachings and speaking of the Irish language, Gaelic. The Great Hunger. Under the British rule, 3/4 of the Irish farmland was used to grow crops that were imported to England. The potato, introduced from the Americas, became the main source of food for most of the Irish people themselves. Still, potatoes were abundant and nutritious enough to support a growing population. Then, in 1845, disaster struck. A blight or disease destroyed the potato crop. Other crops such as wheat and oats were not affected, yet British landowners continued to ship these crops outside Ireland, leaving little the Irish could accept of the blighted potatoes. The result was a terrible famine called the Great Hunger. I've heard called the Irish Potato Famine, but they'll call it the Great Hunger back in a 2001 textbook that I'm reading right now. Witnesses described the many scenes of frightful hunger. One official told of entering what he thought was a deserted village. In one home he saw 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearances were dead, huddled in the corner in some filthy straw. I approached with horror and found by a low moaning they were alive. They were in a fever, 4 children, a woman, and what had been once a man. In a few minutes I was surrounded by at least 200 such phantoms, such frightful spectres as no words can describe, either from famine or from fever. The letters to the Times of London on December 24th, 1846, so it was cold too. In the 4 years, at least 1 million Irish men, women, and children died of starvation and disease. More than 1 million immigrated to the United States and Canada. The Great Hunger, the Irish Potato Famine, left a legacy of Irish bitterness towards English and still exists today. Struggle for home rule. Throughout the century, Irish demands for the self-ruled intensified. In the 1850s, some Irish militants organized the Famine Brotherhood. Its goal was to liberate Ireland from British rule by force. In the 1870s, moderate Irish nationalists found the arousing leader in Charles Stuart Parnell. He rallied Irish members of Parliament to press for home rule, or local government. The debate dragged on for decades. The Irish question disrupted English politics. At times, political parties were so deeply split over the Irish question that they could not take care of other business. As Prime Minister Gladstone pushed for reforms in Ireland, he ended the use of Irish tithe money to support the Anglican Church and tried to ease the hardships of Irish tenant farmers. New laws prevented landlords from charging unfair rents and protected the rights of tenants to the land they worked. Finally, in 1914, lots of 1914, right? Finally, in 1914, Parliament passed a Home Rule Bill, but it delayed putting the new law into effect. When World War I broke out that year, as you will read, the southern counties of Ireland finally became independent in 1921. Very interesting Irish. Very interesting Irish. This is John Michael. This is the Context is Everything Media Network. I hope you have a wonderful day, and God bless. Goodbye.